Julius Lester, To Be a Slave. The paintings that are within this book that I'm reading are by Tom Filling. And again, this is a Puffin Books publication. The ancestry of any Black American can be traced to a bill of sale and no further. In many instances, even that cannot be done. Such is true of part of my family. This book is dedicated to the memory of my great grandparents, Eirus Smith, Maggie Carson, slaves in Arkansas, and Square and Angeline Lester, Austin and Sylvia Jones, slaves in Mississippi, and to those whose names are now unknown. I never knew them, but I am proud to be one of their descendants. I hope that I may be worthy of them, their strength, and their courage. So the contents of this book includes 30 years of To Be a Slave, an author's note, a prologue. There are 7 different chapters, an epilogue, and a bibliography. And we're going to start at 30 years of To Be a Slave. 30 years of To Be a Slave. It was the late 40s. I was not even 10 years old. One day there came in the mail a letter addressed to my father in which a company promised, in big and bold letters, to research the Lester family tree and send us a copy of our family coat of arms. I was excited, but when I saw my father fold the letter as if to discard it, I asked anxiously, "Don't you want to know our family history?" He laughed dryly. "I don't need to pay anybody to tell me about where we came from. Our family tree ends in a bill of sale. Lester is the name of the family that owned us." His words were one of the defining moments of my life. Looking back, I am surprised I knew what he meant. But my father had never hidden that we were descendants of slaves. Yet I suppose I had never understood what that really meant until that moment when I knew my personal past was irretrievably lost. And I probably said that wrong. Don't pay that no mind. Pay attention. One of the many mysteries of existence is why an offer, hold on, what is that? Oh, offhand comment of a parent would imprint itself on the soul of a child, would haunt the child, nag at the child, like some illness that lingers, though it does not interfere with daily living. I was not angry that my family tree ended in a bill of sale. Anger was not a safe emotion for Blacks in the 40s. Rather, I was overwhelmed by a sense of loss. There was an emptiness within me that could not be filled, and I grieved. Though I did not know that then, I needed to be able to follow the trail of my existence back through time, to hear stories about those whose existence had made mine possible. But I did not even know my real name. Some 15 years passed. It was the early 60s. I was living in New York City, making a meager living as a folk singer and guitar and banjo teacher. My wife at the time, Joan Stenau, was in graduate school and introduced me to Black history, a field of which I was completely ignorant. Somehow, I came across a book by B.A. Botkin called Lay My Burden Down. It was the story of slavery in the woods of those who had been slaves. During the Federal Writers Project of the Depression, writers had traveled throughout the country interviewing as many slaves as they could find and had written down their memories. Botkin's book was a compilation of those interviews. From my father, I had learned the names of my slave maternal great grandmothers and both sets of my slave fraternal great grandparents. And I read through Botkin's book eagerly, hoping to find some trace of them. But alas, nothing. Besides my personal disappointment, I was angered by Botkin's book. The slaves depicted there were too reminiscent of the stereotyped Blacks of the movies of the 40s and 50s, happy, laughing, filled with love for white people. I did not doubt that such slaves existed. Growing up in the South, I had seen such servility among the older generation of Blacks. However, I refused to believe that all slaves had loved slavery. I noted that Bodkin had drawn his material from the slave narratives of the Federal Writers Project, which were housed in the archive of folk song at the Library of Congress. I was curious about what he had left out of his book. In the spring of 1963, I went to the Library of Congress and spent several weeks going through the file cabinets that contained the interviews done with ex-slaves in the 1930s. I was still looking for some trace of my slave great grandparents, but in the process, I began writing down on file cards the sentences and paragraphs that I found especially striking. My research at the Library of Congress only fed my interest in these people who had been slaves. Somehow, I stumbled across University Place Bookstore on University Place below 14th Street in Manhattan. It was on the second floor of a nondescript building and specialized in books on what we then called Negro history. Books were shelved haphazardly, and there were as many in stacks on the floor as the shelves. I found a whole genre of literature I had not known existed. Slave narratives, accounts of slavery written in the 19th century by escaped slaves. I bought many and read them, copying our passages that gave me a feeling of what it had been like to be a slave. Summer 1964, I was in Mississippi. Having gone there to be part of the civil rights movement, I was in Laurel, Mississippi, and stood at the edge of a field. I looked around and suddenly I knew that more than 100 years ago a slave had stood at that exact spot and had looked north as I was doing. In that moment, I was returned to that need, born in childhood, to know from whom I had come historically, but now it deepened and ceased to be personal. It was no longer as important to know from whom I had come as it was to know what it had been like to be them. I no longer needed to know the stories of my slave great grandparents because theirs would not be so different from any other slaves. And because my father's family had been slaves in Mississippi, that slave whose presence I sensed at the edge of that field on Laurel could easily have been an ancient relative. 1967. My work in the civil rights movement had led me to write an article, The Sing Out. An article for Sing Out, the folk music magic magazine about the new political and cultural phenomenon known as Black Power. That had led to an offer to write a book, which I had, though only to have the book rejected. However, I acquired an agent and he showed the manuscript to Joyce Johnson, an editor at Dow, who accepted it. Late one afternoon, Joyce and I finished our final editing conference on the manuscript. And as I was getting ready to go, she commented that I had a very simple writing style and she wondered if I had ever thought about writing children's books. I had not. She persevered and asked if I would like to meet Phyllis Fogelman, the children's book editor. I shrugged and said, why not? Phyllis had read the manuscript on which Joyce and I had just finished the final editing, and Phyllis wondered if I had any ideas that might be suitable for a children's book. I paused. Well, I have this idea for a book, I heard myself saying, about what it was like to be a slave. I explained to her the research I had done. She was excited and asked me to write a one-page description. I went home and did so and showed it to her the following day. She liked it. I wrote the book in 3 months. My two oldest children, Jody and Malcolm, playing on the floor next to my desk in the living room of the apartment in the public housing project Joan and I lived in on West 20th Street in Manhattan. The organizational structure, how to orchestrate the voices and weave my narrative in the words of the slaves came easily. It was clear to me that writing this book was one of the things I had been put on earth to do. Now, 30 years have passed. I am gratified that to be a slave has endured. This is due in part to its being recognized by the American Library Association in 1969 as a Newbery Honor Book. Its longevity is also due to Tom Filling's extraordinary paintings, which are simultaneously lyrical and horrifying. They are the perfect complement to the words for those who were slaves. My object in writing the book was to enable the reader to experience slaves as human beings. To be a slave was to be a human being under conditions in which that humanity was denied. They were not slaves, they were people. Their condition was slavery. Those words are from the one-page description I wrote for Phyllis Fogelman, and that description became the opening pages of the first chapter. Of course, my underlying and hidden purpose was simply this. If a child could experience slaves as human beings, then it might be possible for that same child to look at the descendants of slaves and also see another human being, no more, no less. The fact that to be a slave was endured would seem be indicates that a lot of people are willing to make the effort to experience the humanity of those categorized as slaves. I am grateful to the parents, teachers, librarians, and booksellers who have found the book to be of value. Most of all, I am grateful to all those who have read it, to all those who read it. History is not just facts and events. History is also a pain in the heart, and we repeat history until we are able to make another's pain in the heart our own. Julius Lester, Belchertown, Massachusetts, December 14th, 1996. Though it's some 30 years ago, I still remember vividly my first reactions upon reading Julius Lester's manuscript, especially those powerful words coming directly from the mouths of the old people who lived the horrible experience of being enslaved in America. The words jumped off the pages and reached deep down inside me, and I felt I was walking in their shoes. Aware that this manuscript was directed toward young adult readers, and knowing how essential this particular history could be in raising their level of consciousness about America's shameful past, I could see how Julius took time and much care putting the words of our folks in a proper historical context and spiritual order, moving the readers through the humiliating chaos of slavery and its dehumanizing situation with a balanced writer's touch, reflecting reverence and respect also for the wit and sometimes ironic humor of its storytellers. He had done his job well. So my next strong reaction was fear. Could I create images that would complement these powerful words, those powerful real life experiences, and still and all within a 30-day deadline? How could I create 14 images that called up this pain of the past with all its horror and also show, as Julius had already done through his words, a clear admiration for the people who endured this experience and survived it with their humanity still intact? I knew we both felt this important information was essential for everyone in this country to know, and that only by acknowledging the deep, terrible wounds of slavery and its effects on all of us to this very day can we move toward any reconciliation. And as painful as this for many adults, the sooner we expose this truth to even younger children, aware of the fact that they can take it, the sooner we start to develop well rounded, compassionate human beings. Because the truth can stretch children's minds, stimulate their imaginations in a creative way, and strengthen their spirits, preparing them to face reality, reject the shallow and slick, and recognize when they're being lied to. As you can see, I did finish the artwork for this book on time, And with the help of my dual heritage, Black America's bittersweet complexities and Africa's powerful celebratory rites acting as a spiritually strong balancing force to counter even the pain of slavery. I like to believe I included in this art that essential quality that Black people demand of their artists, which is so clear in all our music, especially in the blues, that whatever it is we say or sing or do, let it be passionately expressed and beautifully executed, moving us so emotionally. It makes all of us feel its truth way down deep inside. A year ago in New York City, I visited a public school in Harlem. There, within the warm atmosphere of the school's library, the children's faces seemed to glow with self confidence, surrounded now by many children's books that reflected their own culture. I noticed To Be a Slave was prominently displayed. I thought about the progress that had been made over these many years and those who shared my beliefs about the importance of these particular books for all children in America, both Black and white. Though there is still much more that has to be done, the world of children's books now certainly reflects a more balanced, more honest view of this society. It's reassuring to know that in 1968, To Be a Slave was in the forefront of that movement. Tom Fillings, Columbia, South Carolina, December 15th, 1997. 13. One of the greatest overlooked sources for information concerning slavery has been the words of those who were slaves. During the first half of the 19th century, the American Anti Slavery Society and other Northern abolition groups took down the stories of thousands of Blacks who escaped from the South. The narratives of ex slaves became a literary genre in the period before the Civil War. And these narratives became a potent weapon in the battle to sway Northern public opinion against slavery. After the Civil War, interest in the stories of ex slaves dwindled until the 1930s. It was then that the Federal Writers Project was organized, and one task it undertook was to interview those ex slaves still alive. So hold on. 1930. And people always want to say this was, oh, that was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Well, I don't think so because 100 years from 1930 would be 2030, right? We're not in 2030, we're in 2024. Somebody check my math to see if that's 100 years, please. I don't think it is because it says after the Civil War, interest in the stories of ex slaves dwindled until the 1930s. It was then that the Federal Writers Project was organized, and one task it undertook was to interview those ex slaves still alive. So, ex slaves were still living at this time. At least two books were published using this material: B.A. Botkin's Lay My Burden Down and the Federal Writers Project book, The Negro in Virginia. But most of the material remains unpublished. So let's ask chat real quick if they're familiar with the Federal Writers Project. And let's see what chat says. Absolutely. The Federal Writers Project, FWP, was part of the New Deal initiatives during the 1930s. It aimed to provide employment for writers while documenting and preserving American culture during the Great Depression. The FWP produced various works, including state and city guides, oral histories, and slave narratives. Considering your interest in historical insights and storytelling, exploring FWP's contributions could offer a rich source of content. You might find narratives and perspectives that resonate with your themes of overcoming challenges and manifesting success. How do you plan to leverage this historical context in your content or discussions? I feel a trip to DC coming on. In the spring of 1963, I learned that all of the slave narratives taken down by the Federal Writers Project were stored at the Archive of Folk Song at the Library of Congress. I spent several weeks reading through the over 6,000 pages of manuscripts. I wish to express my thanks to Miss Ray Corson and Mr. Joe Hickerson of the Archive of Folk Song for their kind assistance to me. The 19th century slave narratives and those taken down by the Federal Writers Project differ in one important respect. Differ. Because what's the narrative that you wanted to truly push? Is that the reason that the truth was not recorded, or that part of the truth was recorded? Because we all know that we had good slave masters and bad slave masters. So, continuing on. The Federal Writers Project was as interested in preserving the speech patterns and language of the ex-slaves as it was in gathering information about slavery. Therefore, the interviews were taken down word for word. The 19th century slave narratives were taken down by white abolitionists in many instances and then rewritten by them to conform to the literacy standards of the time. Also, many abolitionists felt that to publish the narratives in the language of the ex-slaves, a language that had its own rules of grammar and pronunciation, would give the enemies of the abolitionists cause ammunition for their arguments of Black inferiority. Thus, great pains were taken to present the stories in a manner that would not be criticized. There is no reason to believe, however, that because these narratives were made to conform to certain literary standards, that they are not reflective of the thoughts and experiences of those who endured slavery. In this book, the reader will find numerous examples of both kinds of narratives. Those of the Federal Writers Project offer the advantage of an earthly directness of communication. The 19th century narratives offer the advantage of analysis of the slave experience. Together, the two present a vivid picture of how the slaves felt about slavery. I have taken the liberty of modernizing punctuation as well as the dialect spellings, which were the attempts of white writers to record Negro speech. This was done for the sole purpose of making the material more readable. The sources of quoted material are indicated beneath each passage. The first line is the name of the ex-slave speaking, if the name is known. The second indicates the source of material by author's name. In 4 instances, there is no author. These are the narrative material taken from the Fisk University collection of slave narratives, the Library of Congress, the transcript of the hearings held by the House of Commons in the slave trade in 1790 and 1791, and from the Negro in Virginia. Extracts from these are indicated by Fisk Library of Congress. Evidence on the slave trade and the Negro in Virginia. Full information on sources can be found in the bibliography. Julius Lester, April 11th, 1968. Prologue. About the later end of August, a Dutch man of war of the burden of 160 tuns arrived at Point Comfort. The commander's name, Captain Joe. his pilot for the West Indies, one Mr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. They met with the terror in the West Indies and determined to hold consort ship hitherward, but in their passage lost one the other. He bought not anything but 20 and odd negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victual, whereof he was in great need, as he pretended, at the best and easiest rates they could. Letter from John Rolfe of the Jamestown, Virginia colony to Sir Edwin Sandys, treasurer of the Virginia Company of London. The Negro in Virginia. P. Periods I. Periods. The African slave trade was already over 100 years old when the Dutch ship landed 20 Africans at the Jamestown colony in 1619. Portugal had introduced Africans to Europe in the early 16th century. The slave trade soon extended into England and Spain and to their colonies in the New World of the Americas when it was discovered. Africans accomplished Spanish explorers on their journeys. Africans accompanied Spanish explorers on their journeys to the New World. There were 30 blacks with Balboa when he discovered the Pacific Ocean. Blacks accompanied Pizarro to Peru, Coronado to New Mexico, Narvaez and Cabeza de Vaca in their explorations of what is now Arizona and New Mexico. Blacks also accompanied the French explorers to Canada and the Mississippi River Valley. Thus, blacks were a part of the New World long before the Mayflower, even before the settling of Jamestown in 1609. So, just right here, because of late we've had circulation that many of the blacks that were in America were not necessarily brought over from Africa, that they were already here in America. So this account actually proves that to possibly be factual. Again, I'm reading papers. I haven't been to the Library of Congress yet, but I feel the trip is coming on. Yet, back to the book, yet, even when the existence of a slave trade and the early presence of blacks in what was to become the United States, slavery was not introduced immediately. The English colonists were in great need of labor to help settle their new colonies. At first, they tried to use the Indians. This proved impossible. The Indians came from a society and a way of life that was relatively uncomplicated. This background did not prepare them for the disciplined and complex way of life and work necessary for the plantation system. They also proved to be very susceptible to the diseases of the colonists. Everywhere Indian labor was used, it proved to be highly unsuccessful. Okay, so I gotta let me just go ahead and interject this as I'm reading it, because again, this is the book club. This is where we take a book, we read the book together, we comment together, and I'm gonna give my comments as I'm reading, and you'll give your comments in the comments. And that's where we're dialogue, but I have various platforms where we can come together and have live discussions. Whether we do that through my TikTok platform, my many Facebook platforms, my Instagram platform, or my podcasting platform. So I'm creating a platform where we can come amicably, amicably, and have adult conversations, whether we're male or female, whether we are black or white, or yellow or brown, or alien. Aliens can come too. We inviting everybody. We just want to keep it respectful, understandable, and there's no pointing the finger at the other person. Tell us what you can do to change you, because you are the only person you can change. Okay, going back to the book. England then tried sending poor whites, prisoners, and debtors from England and Ireland to the American colonies. Men, women, and children were often kidnapped and sent to America to work. These whites were held as indentured servants for 7 years and then released. This soon created the need for a continual supply of people to work. Another disadvantage was simply the fact that a white indentured servant could run away, and because he was white, he could go to another place, change his name, and have no fear of being caught. Let's insert white privilege right there, because a lot of people are trying to get a better understanding of white privilege is, and I think this really summarizes the essence of white privilege. Another disadvantage was simply the fact that a white indentured servant could run away. And because he was white, he could go to another place, change his name, and have no fear of being caught. Something that Black people did not have the privilege of doing, as we're getting into the thick of it. Into the thick of it. Into the thick of it. Hey, okay, back to the book. Gradually, the English colonists turned to Africans as the ideal solution. Because they were Black, it would be difficult for them to run away and escape detection. Two, they could be bought outright and held for as long as they lived. And finally, the supply was inexhaustible. Even today, the supply is still inexhaustible because now we have the pipeline that takes the children from the schools into the juvenile detention system. And as they get in trouble there, you go higher and higher, and then it gets to the point where you never get out, and then you end up in the adult penal system, which I think is the correct term for penitentiary system, and then you're trying to get your way out. I have watched documentaries where you have kids that went in at 9 and 10 years old and they have never been free. So it's still inexhaustible. And that's why I feel that most of these laws were not created to protect and serve. They were created to be sure the supply remains inexhaustible. Back to the book. 18 years after the first Africans came to the Jamestown colony, the first American-built slave ship sailed from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Its name was the Desire. The slave ship sailed to the west coast of Africa, and there the captains of the slave vessels went about their job of loading the ships with blacks to bring to America. Now, if I can try to eloquently describe the picture, you can see a picture where you have the faintness of either the sun that has a cloud coming across it, or there could be a full moon. You can see that it's showing a portion of the ocean. Now, these pictures are all black and white, but you can see the shell ships. But then you can also see land because you see Black men. This looks like all men. I don't see any children. I don't see anything that I could say is a woman or a child. They have this heavy wood neck, and then there's a space, like a one-person space. And then they can. Granny Judah said that in Africa, they had very few pretty things and that they had no red colors in cloth. In fact, they had no cloth at all. Some strangers with pale faces come one day and dropped a small piece of red flannel down on the ground. All the Black folks grabbed for it. Then a larger piece was dropped a little further on, and on until the river was reached. Then a large piece was dropped in the river and on the other side. They were led on, each one trying to get a piece as it was dropped. Finally, when the ship was reached, they dropped large pieces on the plank and up into the ship till they got as many blacks on board as they wanted. Then the gate was chained up, and they could not get back. That is the way Granny Judith said they got her to America. Richard Jones, Bakken, page 57. So, as I was reading that, it just made me think how they say that we consume way more than we bring in. And other cultures bring in more than they consume. And just as I read that account, that is what came to me, that we always want something that we haven't seen, or we just want it. We want it. It's like woo woo woo. So they use red cloth to lure us on the boat. So the way I grew up understanding it is that it was fights between the tribes, and this tribe was given this one and stuff like that. And that might be true. I don't know. But this account came from the mouth of a slave passed down to apparently their grandchild, because it said Granny Judith. Back to the book. The capture of Africans was usually much more difficult from this. When the slave trade began, West Africa had a highly developed civilization with complex economic and political institutions. It was because of their sophisticated civilization that they could be used so easily in the rapidly growing economy of America. Generally, the slave trade was carried out in one of three ways. The first and easiest was simply to lie in the wait until somebody came by and then capture him. This method soon gave way to an alliance between white slave traders and black African tribal chiefs. The African chief would make war on another tribe for the purpose of capturing as many people as possible. He would turn them over to the white slave traders in exchange for various items the chief wanted: tobacco, guns, ammunition, liquor. This arrangement evolved into a more complicated one in which one African chief would align with another chief who would agree to sell some of his own tribesmen or others he had captured in a battle. He would be paid in goods for these soon to be slaves by the first African chief, who in turn would sell them to a white slave trader. Charles Ball, a slave during the early 19th century, came into contact with many Africans who had been brought to America. His own grandfather had come from Africa, and as a child, Ball had heard many stories about Africa from him. In his autobiography, he recorded the story of one slave who was brought from Africa to America. Now, as I read that, what came across my mind was, so it's possible that researching your history will end in a bill of sale. But what if that bill of sale at least takes you back to what part of Africa you originated from? I think that's a dope win, because it gives you connection in some way to where you actually came from, like your whole ancestral. And if you guys haven't watched the movie Roots, I highly recommend watching Alex Haley's Roots. I've never read the book, but I've watched the movie many times. Growing up, my mother required me and all of my siblings, it was a total of 6 of us, she required all of us to come into her TV room, because she actually had a living sitting room, and don't call it a sitting room because you bet not sit in there, okay? So she would call us into the TV room to watch Roots every time that it aired. And we did this every year. So we really knew our history. My mother loved watching the slave movies, and she didn't watch it. I almost don't want to say this because I feel like y'all gonna start going to watch them, but you probably should anyway. but it was the scenes, the intimate scenes between the men and the women. And most time it was the missus and the field hand. And when I say the missus, I mean in whoever master's wife was. And then you would have those moments between master and one of the female slaves, and whether it was like this intimate love story where he kind of tried to sneak and give her everything and, and take care of the baby, or it was one that, was being taken by force or whatever. I think those movies were very prevalent to understanding and having a better connection with this piece of history. I don't, because we don't have VHSs anymore, and I don't know if you can find them on any of these shows. Look, Zeus. I think this is something good for you guys to look into because I like the Zeus network. I don't know about y'all, but I like the Zeus network. For $5.99, baby, sign me up because cable is high, and half of this bullshit and fuckery I don't want to watch. I don't. But I love reality TV. I love a little ratchetness. I am Bougetto. So yeah, and I would say Zeus out of all the networks I could think of. Netflix possibly, but Netflix is getting a little too high. So I'm thinking about my pockets in the $5.99 because I don't want to be the ultimate consumer. I want to hold a little bit of my coin and go buy some dirt. You know what I'm saying? I don't necessarily want to buy a house, which I feel is the American dream. I want to buy some dirt. I want to buy me some dirt. I want to find me the man that I can't live without. Yeah. I want to find a church and say a prayer and let my knee touch the ground. I can't buy love, but I can definitely buy dirt. Now, if y'all think I just came up with that and it sounds so prolific, please understand that's a country song that I absolutely love, and I hate that I don't know the singer's name right now, but I love that song. So from here, we're going to sign out. We will be continuing reading this book throughout the month of January. Our book for the book club for the month of January is To Be a Slave, a Newbery Honor book by Julius Lester, published by Puffin Modern Classics. We will be picking back up on page 20, where we are going to talk about the capture of Africans. Again, we're going to pick up from reading that again, and then we'll carry forward. So we're going to pick up on page 20. It gives you time to get the book, read through the book, leave some comments. But thank you all for joining. Thank you for liking. Thank you for sharing. And above all things, please know that this is a book to be a slave, and it's being read by the one and only Keisha Noir.